probably for the U.S., the most decisive weapon. In fact, its most effective naval weapon for the first half of the Pacific War was the Dauntless dive bomber.
The nature of warfare in general changed dramatically as you progress from the origins of World War I in Europe to the World War II, and the change, I think, continues to be reflected in wars today. I think there's the military turning point, which I would say was Midway and Stalingrad, and there's that's both, I would say, were preceded by a turning point of the morale of the citizens.
Well, Midway was started because the Japanese felt they didn't have a settled picture after the Pearl Harbor attack, and U.S. aircraft carriers were really making pests of themselves with these hit-and-run raids, culminating in a B-25 raid on Tokyo. So it was decided, let's get back to Hawaii and settle affairs with the Pacific Fleet. What they weren't aware of is that we had radio eavesdropping. They started to notice after the war had started that we can predict a lot of habits with the way the Japanese operate, depending on who's talking to whom and how often. And so they were able to predict, for instance, that the Japanese were going to make a move on New Guinea in May of '42, and so that led to the Battle of the Coral Sea. And Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor said, these guys are the real deal. I'm going to believe what they say, because just as the Coral Sea battle was going on, they alerted Admiral Nimitz to the fact we seemed to detect some Japanese interest from Midway, which is the westernmost of the Hawaiian Islands. And so Admiral Nimitz didn't waste any time second-guessing them, and so with Herculean effort, he was able to reinforce Midway and have 3 aircraft carriers standing by to ambush the Japanese as they came in. You see, the advantage a dive bomber has, particularly against a moving target like a ship, is that it's a vertical dive under control, and you're getting closer and closer and closer to your target. And when you're at the right height, you can drop your bomb and have an excellent chance of getting a direct hit, because you're bringing the bomb to the target and then dropping it at the last moment. This is opposed to flying at altitude and then dropping from high altitude. The ship can see when the bombs drop and may have time to maneuver out of the way by the time they finish their drop. So dive bombing basically brought the bomb closer to the target before it was released. And since the dive bombers at Midway didn't have to worry about fighter interceptions, they were able to line up and make their dives and get them as precise as possible. And so that way, the Japanese carriers, which had their hangar decks full of aircraft that were trying to rearm, they had fuel all over the place, were exceedingly vulnerable to when these well-placed bombs arrived. Something that tends to get glossed over or completely misrepresented, that the carrier aviators flying off the Enterprise in the Yorktown, for instance, were probably the best military aviators the U.S. had in 1942. And so they were highly skilled, very up on their doctrine, and they were able to benefit from some weaknesses with the Japanese. For instance, Japanese fighter protection was terrible. They had no discipline at all, and so as the Battle of Midway played out with low-level attacks from torpedo aircraft, all the Zeros basically went down to wavetop level to deal with a string of torpedo actions, and nobody thought to stay up top all the time. And so the dive bombers arrived while nobody was guarding the top, and were able to make their precise dive bombing attacks because they had no fighter opponents to deal with. So even though it was a very close run action, the Japanese wound up losing all 4 aircraft carriers that they brought to the battle, and that put the strategic initiative of the war into play. So the Japanese clearly aren't in charge anymore, but the Allies haven't seized the initiative firmly either. That would be settled with the fighting that went on south of the equator for the rest of 1942.
Midway was essentially stopped the advance of the Japanese Navy.